Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeffrey Wilkinson, the Executive Officer of Wine Communicators of Australia, WCA. Welcome to the WCA Webinar series, where once a month, on the first Tuesday of the month, we use the webinar format to reach out across the Australian wine scene and present compelling topics of special interest to the Australian wine community. A special welcome today to all WCA members, and for those of you who are not yet a member of WCA, you can find out more about joining WCA at winecommunicators.com.au. Today's webinar, brought to you in partnership with the ASVO, is called Who's Running the Show? The Future of the Australian Wine Show System. The webinar today will examine the changing times of the Australian wine scene, improving the breed versus little gold stickers, the perspective of the Australian wine media, the change to the 100-point judging scale, the achievements of the Len Evans tutorial reunion, which was held in August 2012, the future, where to now. Of course, being a webinar, it's in an interactive format, and we'd love to be able to take your questions. So the Q&A is available in the box, the interactive box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You can type your questions in there, and the presenters will be taking messages, questions throughout the webinar. That's one of the beauties of this format. There will be a exit survey at the end of the webinar, and we really would like you to take just 2 minutes. It's a short survey. Fill that in. Tell us what you liked about it, what you'd like to see more of in the future. It's invaluable feedback for us. You don't have to feverishly take notes of the presentation. It will be emailed to everybody who has registered. The presentation will be emailed out to you. And please make a diary date for the first Tuesday of next month, Tuesday, November 5th, where we'll be presenting in partnership with the GWRDC's Consumer Perception Series, a webinar called New China Insights. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sam Connew and Mike Bennie, your presenters for today.
Thanks, Jeffrey. We'll talk a little bit about how this all started in a minute, but just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sam Connew. I'm a winemaker, but I'm currently working for the Australian Wine Research Institute in the Hunter Valley. I wear a couple of other hats though, so I'm also a board member of the Australian Society of Viticulture and Oenology and head up their wine show committee, and as well as being the deputy chair of the Sydney Royal Wine Show. And here in the Hunter Valley, I'm also heavily involved with the Len Evans tutorial and judging a few other wine shows as well. Over to you, Mike.
Hi, everybody. Mike Bennie here. Wine writer, journalist and presenter, working across a variety of publications, but most actively in Australian Gourmet Traveller Wine, the online wine publication Winefront, Sun Herald Style Magazine and a few others, and also a very active wine judge both here in Australia and overseas, and hoping to bring a bit of perspective on both local, from ground up through to international perspectives on wine show judging today. Welcome everybody.
Awesome. So I guess just an overview of what we're going to be discussing today, and as Jeffrey indicated at the start, we'd love to get some questions rolling as we progress through the webinar. But this seems like a really good opportunity, the WCA webinar format, to update everyone about what's happening both in capital cities and in regional wine shows. And Mike can also obviously give an overseas perspective as well. And the wine show system. So there's been quite a few changes over the last few years, and a lot of that was galvanised through the Len Evans tutorial reunion last year, and we'll talk a little bit about that further on. But as we've got on that slide there, you know, I mean, there's always constant appraisal and reappraisal, I suppose, of the wine show system, whether it does achieve the purposes that it sets out to achieve. There's a huge amount of money that goes into wine shows by exhibitors in the form of both direct cash and exhibits, so wine. Do we get return on our money from that? Are we engaging consumers enough? and have wine have the first purpose of wine shows in terms of improving the breed, has that really run its course? So we'll cover off some of those topics this afternoon. And more specifically, I guess, what we're going to address over the next few slides is a little bit of a background on the Australian wine show system, because it does have an incredibly rich and interesting history. What wine shows evolved for originally, and are we still addressing that? What's changed over the last 10, 20 years? And then some of the new issues and new things that are changing at the moment. And then obviously Mr. Mike Bennie will give us a media perspective on what's happening there. Won't you, Mike?
I sure will, yes.
So I guess just a little bit of a background, because wine shows in this country have been going for years and years and years, literally since the start of the colony. And just speaking for myself, I wasn't aware until I started to do some reading about what an important role agricultural societies played at the start of the colony in establishing all forms of agriculture, really. Because at that point, obviously, there was no agricultural departments or industry organisations, so agricultural societies really filled that gap. And right from the start, there was wine shows. So the first wine show in Australia was held in 1826. And they filled a really important role of ensuring the saleable condition of wine, which was going back to the UK. So when the Napoleonic Wars were on, there was no wine coming from Europe, so Australia was a very important source of wine. But with the transport from here to there were some real issues with quality, and that's how wine shows evolved, was to both improve wine quality and provide proof of its quality. So right from the start, wine shows have been about communicating both to consumers and producers, and since that point have really evolved to reflect the needs of industry. And you can sort of track all of that through the involvement of the wine industry and how wine shows have stayed abreast of that evolution. Mike, I'm not sure how that is similar or dissimilar to other wine shows around the world.
Look, I would have to assume that it's a similar line of trajectory for assessing and comparing and contrasting wines to meet our standards within various winemaking communities. But I think perhaps a bit more focused in Australia on how we've evolved the responsibilities and role of the Royal Agricultural Society. I think it's a lot more localised in Europe for the most part, and perhaps a lot less sort of interbreeding between wine shows until it gets to a more international level. So there's a big gap, I think, between wine shows, or particularly assessment within wine communities in Europe and then international shows. Also, it seems to me anyway.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, you know, most people are pretty aware of the extraordinary number of wine shows that we do have in Australia. I think it's heading upwards of 60 to 70 at the moment. There's obviously the capital city wine shows, including the National Wine Show at Canberra, and then a plethora of regional shows, like McLaren Vale, Hunter Valley, etc., and then specialist shows as well. So the like the International Riesling Challenge, and you know, I think that the Riverina does Sweet White show. So there is a whole network of shows that has evolved over that period since 1826. So it's really a unique selling point, I think, for the Australian wine industry, that depth that's associated with the number of shows around. So I guess the main function, as I've said, was to ensure quality and also provide feedback to exhibitors. So we've always talked about improving the breed. I'm not sure if that's a Len Evans quote, that improving the breed scenario, but he certainly used to say it quite a lot. So the point was a consistent and objective appraisal system which should work to improve winemakers' understanding and attitude to absolute quality. So it was all about reducing the number of faults primarily at the start. And for that reason, the vast majority of judges up until recently were winemakers for that reason, because we are the technicians, the technocrats, the fault Nazis. And I still think, there has been a lot of discussion about this improving the breed scenario and whether it's still relevant, particularly with some of the criticism of Australian wine over, I guess, since the 90s as being, homogenous and boring and mass-produced, and whether that's been exacerbated by wine shows and by that winemaker primacy as judges. But I still think that for regional wine shows, that improving the breed plays a very relevant role. And maybe with the capital city shows, it's more about style as opposed to just guarding against faults. Do you think that's a fair point, Mike?
Yeah, look, I was going to add into that, for me, regional shows, and we'll probably touch on this further down the track, really are the building blocks for the formal wine show system in Australia. And I don't see it exclusively as improving the breed, but also about identifying potential. And you see a lot of wine producers entering wines into the local shows to sort of compare and contrast against peers, but also, I guess, to have a little bit of independent insight into what varietal and or blend wines might work best in regions and or regions surrounding the region of primacy. So it's a sort of, it's a shift away from just improving the breed to, looking at what is delicious from that area and then trying to communicate what might be exciting and different from that region and showing great potential to broaden within the very wide scope that we have in Australia to grow grapes where we like.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think, one of the most exciting things about judging at regional wine shows at the moment is seeing some of those new varieties and styles coming through and saying, yes, this, Aglianico really works here, or Touriga. I just judged recently at the Mudgee Wine Show and there was some new varietals there, and a Touriga actually got wine of show. So to see those varieties coming through, and as a judge you can say, hey, look, potentially this is where you guys should be moving instead of Chardonnay, for example, because obviously is the bog standard varieties which have been planted in each region. But with some of those new varietals coming through that show good promise in those regions, it's a really good indicator of what's going to work and what's not.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting to sort of see how often in regional wine shows there's the opportunity for success of varieties that don't come from the noble varieties, but then a reluctance to do so in the capital city shows, that by some measure or scope that the noble varieties have a greater quality or balance sought by judges, which is always a bit perplexing to me.
Yeah. We've actually got a pop-up poll, which if you guys could very quickly just answer a few questions there in regard to your participation, I guess, on different levels in wine shows. We'll be able to get these results. Once you complete the polls, we'll be able to get the results up. You can see it's happening right now. Geez, it's so exciting. So it's a pretty good indicator to us of what's going on anyway. So whilst that's all happening, one of the other things that, apart from improving the breed, that wine shows are all about is engaging with consumers. So the little gold stickers, the trophies, the silverware has played an enormous role in the marketing of Australian wine, basically since the 1960s. Obviously, for a consumer, the most well-known trophy is the Jimmy Watson, but certainly the use of gold medals, silver medals, even bronze medals has been utilised enormously over the last 20, 30 years. There's been a lot of debate about whether that actually does sell wine. And I know on-premise-wise, like a lot of soms will say that they don't really listen to wine show results, or, you know, gold medals don't make that much difference in decisions. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I think that, and this is going to be touched on later on by me in that section called The World According to Mike, which doesn't mean that everyone should be wearing tracksuit pants 24/7 and attending public events. But I think that the problem with, well, not the problem, but the contemporary communication of medals and trophies is a lag behind where people are actually understanding wine and learning about what wines are performing well. Stickers on bottles and results from wine shows aren't as consumable or immediate as, say, jumping online and researching a wine. And the other thing that I find quite interesting is that often wine show results are communicated once, somewhere tucked away on a website without much ability, without the ease of access for a consumer or for people within the wine industry, or in the form of disposable A4 printed sheets of paper, which are then tossed away after a tasting. And it's that legacy of not being able to identify who's performed well and who's exceeded at wine shows that's really a bit of a problem, in that communication is so disposable of wine show results, but people need to find a better way to engage with the wine shows. So there's this whole issue of how communication of results gets out to the market these days.
Mm.
And to me,
with the changing way that we communicate as well, with social media having developed so quickly, and maybe, you know, wine shows are starting to get on board now, but it's there's been a bit of a lag with that. So it's using all forms of communication to get those wine show results across.
Yeah. So go on, Sam.
So I guess, you know, one of the biggest things that has changed over the last 30, 40 years, and these next couple of slides demonstrate this quite easily. So this photo is from the Sydney Wine Show archive. Thank you to them for providing it, but I think it's a classic photo. Pretty cool. So Arthur Kelman, who's second from the left in that photo, still has a trophy named after him. This was taken sometime in the 1930s. So compare and contrast that photo with this photo. So this is the Royal Queensland Wine Show this year. And I'm sure people recognise quite a few of the judges there, but definitely a changing of the guard and a changing group of wine show judges, which I think has had a huge impact on both the culture and I think the results, would be fair to say, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years. And it's probably fair to say that that the Len Evans tutorial has had a huge amount to do with that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, looking at the picture of the you know, old men judges in white coats, and then the very colourful array of judges from a variety of and diversity of backgrounds in terms of wine. I sometimes wonder if it's simply just a matter of changing clothes. That, you know, the new judges wear sneakers and t-shirts, the old judges wore white lab coats. And yes, there is a greater diversity of the judging pool, but really are our results that different when you look at them on paper? I mean, there's extraordinary moments where style comes into play. As Nick Ryan says, the days of the technocrat judge are falling away and the stylist judge is ascending. But again, for the most part, a lot of wine that finds its way, particularly in the capital city wine shows, to champion wines seems to champion a a style that comes from groupthink? And, is the groupthink of the past so different to the groupthink of the future? Are we just looking at a shift away from technocracy to style that ignores one or the other? Sometimes I just wonder, and I'm just sort of throwing that out there because having observed a number of wine shows where we're purporting to have changed the culture and purporting to move culture forward, I sometimes see what I would think are results that still come from a fairly conservative standpoint and come from a reluctance to really push boundaries.
Mm. But I guess, that was one of the most positive things for me judging, as we both did recently at the Adelaide Review Hot 100, was firstly judging on drinkability first and foremost, which I think is a really interesting way to approach it. It sounds stupid, but you really do view wines differently if you've got that as your primary objective. And then to see the range of styles that come through when you're just concentrating on that. As a judge, I think I was possibly judging a little bit more openly with that in mind. But I guess, what I'd like to think is happening is that people are promoting a variety of different styles, and that's certainly something that I like to champion is, let's not get stuck into that we're looking for wines that look like this and that tick the box, whether it's that funky Chardonnay or whatever, is that we should be trying to pull up wines that across the board that show a variety of different styles, whether it's cool climate Shiraz or a warm-up climate Shiraz or whatever. We should be able to find gold at all of those levels, I think, and promote them. Because I think there is that diversity in the Australian wine industry now. I think we are making those wines.
Absolutely, and look, I think there's a positive change in the last decade or so. There's been a great positive change to diversifying the judging pool. But at the end of the day, the way that wines are judged, the actual modality of judging, aside from that Adelaide Review Hot 100 show, which is so unique, is still the same. And therefore, we may have shifted away from the results per se of the past, but we're still creating a new legacy of results in a framework that's now decided by this new style of judging. And so, what I'm positing is that there may be other ways of thinking about wine show judging that perhaps have a more consumer-orientated bent if we are now working towards consumers, allowing wines to be very expressive, diverse in style, rather than looking for the best of a style that we all think is currently excellent.
Yeah.
So anyway, look, only positive things to say about progress, but just curiosity about the shift from most people's thinking of the past to today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the fact that we're actually having this discussion now is in large part due to the influences of the Len Evans tutorial and, as you said, having the people from different backgrounds. So, generally if you compare to judging panels now, as that slide shows, we're generally younger. There's a younger proportion of people judging. There's definitely, more sommeliers and retailers, and that was something that Evans certainly wanted to encourage and to propagate, was to get away from just winemakers being the judges. There's more women coming through, through both the tutorial and the advanced wine assessment course. About a third of both are women now. So it's been an invaluable training ground for judges in conjunction with the advanced wine assessment course. And I think, Mike, both of us have felt the benefit of that.
Yeah, definitely. Look, there's no denying that the Len Evans tutorial sort of works as a great fast tracking and a week of immersion that's, without parallel in terms of education. But again, an idea to throw out there is that perhaps we're narrow tracking things with looking to the Len Evans tutorial and the Advanced Wine Assessment course as the only two really authoritative channels to wine show judging. As chairman of Canberra Regional Wine Show last week, and I know the Hunter Valley does this exceptionally as well, but working on a training program within the show that actually gives vocational experience in a wine show, particularly from people who've graduated from working as a steward who understand the culture of the show. I think we've lost sight a little bit with other channels to judging. And again, I don't hark back as a spruiker for the Adelaide Review Hot 100 show, but to bring in different palettes in terms of a professional sake judge and then a food judge was quite a unique proposition and came with its challenges, of course, in terms of linguistically expressing wine, but also gave a breadth of scope that is kind of unheard of in the wine judging scene as well. And I think invaluably, again, at the Hunter Valley show, having a consumer judge, well knowledgeable judge, also is an interesting standpoint that isn't replicated across Australia. And sometimes I think our narrow band of what we think is the most beneficial influence on wine shows is also a disservice in some respects too.
Excuse me, Sam and Mike, you might like both to comment on this. Ulrich has asked if we can take a quick look at the international scene and if you think the Australian system is better than other countries. If you'd like to perhaps compare and contrast and comment on that.
Sure. Look, I'm happy to talk about the international scene and the Australian scene in the same context. The international scene is of judging in the international shows in Europe specifically is based around what's called the OIV system, which is a judging mechanism based on the 100-point scale. You're given a series of boxes to check against profiles of the wine, colour, aromatics and flavour, much like the 3, 7, 10 of the old 20-point system in Australia, but built up to 100 points. And you mark the score sheet in terms of intensity, so from 1 through to 5 in terms of aromatics of the wine, and you build up a score towards 100 rather than marking backwards per se. The 100-point scale is then delineated through a series of statistics across a panel of 5 people. Independent judges are not allowed to talk during the tasting process. Each wine is brought out as a single glass to the table by a sommelier. And once you have marked your score sheet, you hand it in and scores are read out. And the panel chair may or may not wish to discuss results, but an aggregation of the scores gives the final mark out of 100. That's half of the score sheet. On the other half of the score sheet is actually flavour and aroma profile descriptions from 1 through 5 again in terms of intensity. And it can be that aromas smell woody from 1 through 5, or stone fruit smell woody from 1 through 5, etc., flavour and aromas. These score sheets are fed into a computer. The computer aggregates the results for both the score and also for the flavour profile. And computers then generate infographics which show you intensity of flavours on a flavour wheel, which becomes a nice pretty diagram that consumers are increasingly being exposed to in Europe. Now, to answer the question about the compare and contrast, the perfect world for me would be a little bit of the Australian system and a little bit of the OIV system. The OIV system's lack of collegiate discussion, I think, is a great downfall, and the great benefit of Australian wine show judging is the ability to rationalise and to find common ground based on discussion through returning to wines and through collegiate judging. What the European system offers is a very advanced, very detailed statistical response to wine show judging that actually trickles through to other things we'll talk about later, including professional judging circuit. The statistics of judging in the OIV system mean that your scores are given back to you at the end of the day. They double blind wines in a bracket to see if you're able to identify the same wine twice. If you get close to the wine, then obviously you're seen as a better taster. If you're miles apart on the same wine, then unfortunately you may be deemed as a little less experienced. And then your scores are aggregated against the group you're judging in, and then against the whole wine show, against styles. And several panels will judge the same wine in their judging scope. So what it gives you is a very complicated but very interesting set of data that actually assesses your tasting ability based on the group's tasting outcomes. So that, married to the Australian system in which we can assess and work on improving the judge breed before we improve the wine breed, is actually a pretty neat idea.
Yeah.
That's the sort of nuts and bolts of where OIV versus Australia lands.
Mm. And I think there's been some talk, like we're already discussing, it's on the agenda anyway, a greater accreditation system for wine show judges in Australia. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. There's just been a question that's come through about the issues of using consumer judges, which I'm not sure if they still do, but the Advertiser, the South Australian Wine of the Year competition used to use consumer judges. I mean, obviously the biggest hurdle with that is just sheer stamina, really. You certainly couldn't expect consumers to judge the number and the volume of wines that we judge, and that's simply because, whether you're a winemaker or a retailer or like you, Mike, you can see all your samples behind you there for tasting, that you're actually used to judging a lot of wines per day. So the stamina part of it is a big part of it. But I have seen it where consumers judge like the top 5 wines and then they pick a consumer award, which I think is a really good way to do it.
Well, also, just to touch back onto the European system, all judges are only required to judge approximately 15 wines in 3 brackets. So it's 45 wines per day. Each wine is given 2 to 5 minutes, if you wish, on the table in front of you. Sometimes I wonder if we just added some more wine judges to each wine show and made the actual number of wines needed to be judged per day a little less, that we might also find an improvement in judging circumstances. I tend to think that, I've heard of wine shows that I haven't participated in, but we're pushing 150, 160, up to 200 wines per day. Even myself tasting most days with a fairly rigorous schedule of tasting and training for tasting, I feel that assessment by the end of the day with that volume of wine does have to suffer. And I think that reassessing the wine show system to include more judges would probably be a greater benefit than, and in that respect, consumers would be much more inclusive if it was a lesser number to judge through per day.
Yeah. So that feeds really nicely onto the next slide in terms of changes that have happened. And I think most capital city wine shows and certainly regional wine shows are attempting to reduce the number of wines per day. 120 seems to be what people are aiming for as a reasonable size. And just to give you an indication, when I first associate judged at Sydney in 2003, we were regularly doing over 200 wines a day, and I remember one afternoon doing over 108 current vintage Cabernets after lunch, which was just, appalling. Some of the other changes are the move to reed-ale glasses, which I think has made a huge impact on being able to really pick up those more delicate restrained styles. Smaller judging brackets we've got at the top there, so you're not assumed to be able to get through massive brackets of wine all at once. Judging like with like, which I'm a big fan of, so judging Heathcote Shiraz all together in a big Shiraz class, or in Heathcote Shiraz, and then you move on to Macaroni Shiraz. And you don't necessarily know what region they're from, but I think you're looking at oranges and oranges rather than oranges and lemons. Schedules are becoming easier to understand. I think most exhibitors would agree with that they're a lot easier than they used to be in terms of having multiple classes really for the same wines. So we're losing that split between commercial and what used to be the varietal or premium classes. and entry requirements are going down as well, so it's making it easier for smaller wineries to enter their wines. The interesting thing now is trophy judging, and I've seen this at a few shows, and it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than it used to be. We all used to do the trophy judging in complete silence, which was just ridiculous after having spent days of communicating and reaching a consensus and really talking our way through to what the best result is. And now, as opposed to complete silence, I think there's a bit more discussion at most wine shows about the trophies, which I don't think it's the perfect system yet, but I think it's probably a step in the right direction.
Yeah, Sam, welcome to Phil Sexton, the chairman of Royal Melbourne Wine Awards. Phil's just asked, is everyone aware of the move to judging in regional clusters? Are you able to elaborate on that quickly, please?
Yeah, so I guess with the move towards simpler schedules, we've ended up with larger classes. So if there's a class for current vintage Shiraz, and it could be over 200, 300 wines, that's split amongst Melbourne, Sydney, 6 panels or what have you, 6 or 7 or 8 panels, but split according to the provenance of the wine generally. So, so each panel will judge a certain number of regional splits. So you might have 10 wines, 10 Chardonnays that are from Margaret River, 10 Chardonnays from the Hunter Valley, and then 10 Chardonnays from the Yarra Valley. Most judges I know don't elect to know what the regions are, but they want to know where the split is. So you know that you're judging a different region, you just don't necessarily know what the region is. And I don't think knowing the region makes any difference, really. I mean, he just, at the end of the day, a good judge will judge what's in the glass in front of them rather than bringing to the table the fact that this is a Margaret River Chardonnay, so I judge it differently. Of course, you shouldn't judge it differently. So, yeah, I think it makes, as I said, it kind of eliminates that apples and oranges discussion that we used to have. So, and I think it's easier for your palate as well to calibrate. Mike, do you agree?
Yeah, look, I do. I think judging wines serves a very good purpose, but I'd advocate taking it to the next level, in which we should be, and this is quite revolutionary, and I like throwing it out there, but we should eliminate looking at judging wines by variety and look to put the onus back on producers to decide where their style genre fits and judge by style. If I have a heavily oaked, full-bodied, robust Shiraz from the Barossa next to a 13.5% alcohol, lighter shade of Barossa Shiraz, I mean, really, it's not still judging like with like. And it's the same with producers who enjoy a little bit of extra winemaking work in Chardonnay versus producers who are looking to find the racier, more linear styles. So, my advocacy would be to look again in terms of making it friendlier for consumers to have their wines presented to them following judgment in terms of style. Medium-bodied Shiraz from cool climate, or full-bodied Shiraz from warm climate, and delineating in a slightly different way that changes the way that wine show results are presented.
Yeah, and that may be more of a function of, as you say, how the results are presented rather than how the wines are entered or judged, maybe?
Well, I mean, either yes and yes, definitely. But, we're still judging the wines irrespective. They're still going to pass across our palate. But regional grouping doesn't necessarily make... somebody just, Ulrich here saying warmer regional wines also are being judged unfavourably. That's not the case at the Adelaide Review Hot 100, where there is a class for wines of power and presence, and there's still wines that obviously have to come forward from that class to be judged as best of class. So, in fact, what it's doing is actually democratising the way we judge wines in many respects. If we have to have winners of style classes versus winners of actually variety.
Yeah, panel, we've got just over a quarter of an hour to run, so with about another 9 slides to go, so I think we need to just keep moving a bit if we can, please.
So I guess this slide kind of addresses maybe some of the criticisms that seem to keep popping up in regard to wine shows and what we were talking about just then, Mike, in terms of not engaging consumers enough, either domestically or internationally. You know, judge accreditation, we've kind of spoken a little bit about that as well. I guess the money-making issue is always a part of it. There seems to be a perception that there's a huge amount of money that goes into capital city wine shows, but certainly the perspective that I've had being involved in the Sydney Royal Wine Show is the amount of infrastructure that needs to be supported through all of that. And there's also a lot of money that goes back to industry, and I know a lot of those capital city wine shows now are, or have done in the past, and certainly are continuing to do so in terms of supporting the tutorial. Hobart and Sydney have scholarships, for example, that they give to up-and-coming winemakers or what have you, so there is a lot of money that goes back into industry, and the consensus seems to be that without sponsorship, most capital city wine shows wouldn't be viable. So in terms of an industry clique, it's an interesting one. I think, you know, all wine shows exist on the basis of volunteer labour, and all of them seem to be overworked and not paid at all. So if there is anyone that wants to get involved in wine shows, then most of them are absolutely crying out to have more people involved. So certainly with regional wine shows, that's a huge mechanism to get new people into the wine show system. We've spoken a little bit about the 100-point scale, but certainly there's been a huge movement to that over the last 12 months. Certainly Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland, and I think and many regional wine shows now are moving to that scale. What are your thoughts on the 100-point scale, Mike? Do you think it is it more useful for consumers to be using?
Look, I think that just to take a step away from that, I think that the way that results are presented to consumers is the issue, not necessarily the way that we present the final result. I think that the methodology of photocopied books that come out in terms of class and then entry number, gold, or who scored high, rather than just being presented in a very neat, digestible format of something akin to, say, a top 10 list or aggregated by score, aggregated by score by variety, aggregated by score by variety by region, whatever it might be. I think that the real mitigating factor in getting consumers engaged is how we present the final results, not necessarily the 20-point scale, the gold medal, bronze medal, silver medal scale, or 100-point scale. But to answer the question more directly, I think that it is more palatable to have a 100-point scale, but I think the issue with 100-point scale in wine shows is whose voice is it? Most consumers look to align themselves with media who use the 100-point scale based on their understanding of their tasting regime and or personality or whatever it might be. But is the wine show itself a bit too neutral in personality to impart real seriousness with a score that's out of 100? And then why do we put a medal next to it and not just a score and do away with medals?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, what we're saying is that it's one part of the solution. It's not the solution. There's no silver bullet. So certainly from a judging perspective, I really enjoy judging out of 100. So we've got another poll, which we might bring up now, if that's okay, Jeffrey or Michelle, on the some of the things that you would like to see come through or happen on wine shows. So there's a few different fields there. So if everyone can click away on that. I think we're going to be able to see the results of this we'll talk about the results of this once we've finished this poll, and then the previous poll we can see the results at the end, so that might come through in the feedback at the end. So that's all. More international, formal judge accreditation. I think the good thing about more people getting involved in wine shows as well is simply having the insight that being involved behind the scenes, whether it's stewarding or, as you said, Mike, the training system that they have at Hunter is just getting an insight into how it all works. Because I think there is a perception that it all happens behind closed doors, and that there's a bit of weird stuff that goes on that no one knows about, which obviously isn't correct.
Yeah, look, I think there's we talk about cultural shift in terms of wine shows and wine show judging, but sometimes I wonder, you know, we're still looking at the end of the day, and it's very enjoyable, but, you know, drinking a lot of fancy imported wines, and really, I mean, after tasting 200 wines in a day, the first thing I feel like is a beer, and the second thing I feel like is a beer, and not necessarily getting stuck into a lineup of hundreds of dollars worth of Grand Cru equivalent wines that I end up tipping into buckets, racing through to match wine and food courses. And I think we haven't advanced that far from culture. I'll just use the example again, and it's not to piss in my own pocket, but last week at the Canberra Regional Wine Show, I insisted that we drink last year's winners with a very humble meal. And it sort of engaged everyone to sort of think about how they were, you know, going to assess the show the next day, and it gave benchmarks for what we were trying to do, which is actually drill down into the region itself and look for provenance. And I don't say it's, you know, I don't want to take pleasure away from anybody, but I just think culturally we keep talking about how far we're coming, but really we're still in a fairly similar mindset about how we approach the wine show system and its dissemination into the wine community and beyond.
Cool. So what came pretty clearly through from that poll was that people wanted a much more formal judge accreditation system, more feedback to exhibitors, and a more transparent judging system. So the good thing is that there are all avenues that are being worked on at the moment. A lot of which were discussed at the Len Evans tutorial reunion last year. We had a big discussion there about communicating wine show results to consumers. Minimum standards for all wine shows was one of the outcomes from that as well. And also establishing an association of judges, which sort of tied in with that accreditation system. So where that moves on to some of the outcomes that have or are starting to happen, which relates to some of those poll results, is these technology is starting to be used more and more. We used iPad for the first time at Sydney this year, and that provides a great mechanism to get some immediate feedback to exhibitors, because obviously typing it out, it's right there in a readable format, which is a novelty for most judges. So that's all part and process of what's happening. The ASVO, which I sit on, we're in the process of revamping the judges register and are hoping to reference group to help do that and to review current ASVO judging standards, which were first written in 1991 or something like that. Oh no, 2000, so about 10 years ago anyway, so that's happening. One of the most exciting things I think to happen from the reunion was the formation of the Capital City Wine Show Committee. So unbelievably, representatives of the Capital City Wine Shows hadn't met before the reunion. So that was one of the big outcomes from the reunion. And again, that committee is working on several points, which are discussed there. There's been 3 meetings held since the reunion, so one in Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide. Terms of reference have been agreed upon. There's, various goals that everyone's agreed to work towards, and you'll see some of those actions there, which I think, we can look at and say that they're going to be pretty easily achievable, but it's great to have that communication going. One of the other elements that came out of that is encouraging each of the capital city wine shows to work together with the regional wine shows in their state, so that this flow of communication just keeps happening. I know Victoria's, the Melbourne Wine Show is already doing that and has met with wine shows in Victoria. In Sydney, we've got a meeting coming up with our regional wine shows in November. So that's this is all very much happening at the moment. So it's all good to see some really positive outcomes coming from the tutorial reunion.
Sam, is there a wine judging app available?
We've actually just been, you're talking about results or
yes.
Wine show results app?
No, for judging, like you're talking about the use of iPads, is there actually an app that...
Well, because like Sydney, for example, their app makes use of the judging that they do in fine food and dairy. So it's not a common app that can be shared across wine shows. So from what I can understand, most of the ag societies have their own IT departments, and they obviously have their own requirements as to judging within that particular agricultural society. But Mike and I have both been involved in feedback on the iPad system for Sydney to make it more usable and more user-friendly, and hopefully next year is going to be a lot easier than it was this year. So, right, wine media perspective.
Yeah, look, I think we've touched on a lot of this previously, but just to run, I know we're running out of time, but to run through these bullet points. We touched on it before, but the communication of wine show results falls short of technology and media consumption. I noticed Jeff G on the conversation panel here talking about the show system must be above corruption with using a 100-point scale. 100-point scale, 20-point scale, gold, silver, bronze, it's shifting deck chairs around the Titanic, really. Communication of wine show results needs to advance along with technology. I was having a chat with a wine show committee member last week and saying, why are consumers not being given the full information of a wine show in the means of digital technology in which they can open up a resource and be in a store looking at which wine show won which medal? It's a simple thing to aggregate all those results and put them somewhere so that people can update and have a unified resource for how certain wines have performed or which wines have scored what. And somebody somewhere out there who's much smarter than I am would surely be able to aggregate these results into something that's more digestible for consumers who in the end are the people who I guess find most benefit from wine show results in finding wines that they might want to drink. Point number two is, are wine shows now competing with media and sommelier recommendation? What is the relevancy of a wine show to consumers if they're consuming information about wine from competitive sources and sources that are much more immediate and don't happen just once a year? And that's sort of something that I think is a struggle for wine shows going forward is what is the relevancy of the wine shows, which is a sort of open-ended question. If it's for wine producers to benchmark their wines against other producers, well then in isolated circumstance, I think we're doing a very, very good job. But with the advancement of technology and consumption of media, the power of the wine show in terms of communicating what is good wine is dissipating with competition. I think we've again touched on this before. Technical prowess and the search of balance versus drinkability. You and I judged the Adelaide Review Hot 100 and saw the results of looking for wines that are drinkable over that are actually technically correct and show amazing balance. And somewhere in a matrix of all that, I think there is a better way of judging that's not being communicated to people, and that is not just suddenly identifying a fault and saying the wine is to be discredited, although, this is a long piece of string, and looking for wines that, show a variety of personalities, bringing back not 3 of the same wine that are technically excellent, but 3 wines that have personality. So this is just another sort of open-ended question. And we've already discussed Australia versus international advances in terms of judging. I'm loving that we've shifted to iPads and a very good spreadsheet system for judging at the Sydney Royal Wine Show, but why we're not looking then at data and using that for our benefit is a strange thing for me. And that ties into communication of wine show results, judge accreditation in terms of looking at statistically how people are judging against a median curve, and then presenting statistics against wines when they're finally judged. What styles are getting up? What wines from which regions are performing better? Why? This is a thing for nerds, but I think that it will also give us some pretty interesting data that we're really not looking at. And it's a unique opportunity to harvest data about wine and tasting that we're just throwing away at the end of a wine show.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think, obviously, one of the advantages of using an iPad system is that we can hopefully capture that data more easily, whether it's through evaluating use of sensory terms used or what have you. But I have got it going through my brain that this might require a fact-finding mission to Europe to do some understanding of their statistical analysis. It sounds like it's something that we could quite easily incorporate into our...
Okay, panel, just a couple of minutes to go, please. So next couple.
Sure.
Oh.
So I guess, one of the couple of other things that are on the pipeline is, acknowledging that capital city wine shows are part of a broader system is really exploiting the synergies of being part of competitions which also judge food, fine food, beer and cider. So there's a lot of crossovers there, which I think can make it a lot more interesting to the consumer in terms of outcomes as well. So we talked a little bit about communicating wine show outcomes to the consumer, but a lot of Australian wine is exported, so we need to do a much better job of taking this internationally as well. And we've talked about what a robust system we have, and I really don't think that we've exploited that nearly enough. And apps, obviously, whether it's a judging app that we've discussed or a wine show results app, I think would be an amazing tool for a consumer just to be able to tap on a wine and see, what it's done at what wine show or what the trophy winners were at Melbourne, or all on one central database would be pretty incredible. Whether that's achievable or not with limited funds, who knows, but it's certainly something that's been discussed, so it's great that these things are actually on the table, I guess. Yeah, what else do we have to talk about, Mike?
I'm not sure, maybe some questions from the floor.
Sure.
I think we've covered most of them as we've gone along. Jeff Goodworth does comment, though, that in the change to the 100-point system, the range of points that judges are really using suffered a reduction of about 10%. Before, out of 20, typically bad wines were given 12, so you went between 12 and 18.5 and 19 for a troph. But in the change to 100 points, really nothing much gets scored below 75, which is a reduction. Do you want to comment on that quickly, Mike, please? You've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that prescribing definitive scores out of 100 to wines in wine shows is a little bit dangerous and needs to be worked on. I find it strange that we still then ascribe the old gold, silver, bronze if we are using 100 points, and perhaps we need to ditch one in favour of the other, or conversely throw all that out the window and present top 10 results only. No, nothing else but aggregated best ofs, which is a bit radical and probably a whole other discussion for another time, but certainly I don't know if it would be better to aggregate bite-sized pieces of information.
Look, thank you very, very much, Sam. Thank you, Mike. That's fantastic. The conversation continues on the WCA website on the blog. We encourage you to go there and if you've got ideas, comments on this, because the wine show system has been fundamentally so important in the Australian improvement of Australian quality wine. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and it has a role to play in the future. ASVO wants to be part of that. Wine Communicators of Australia wants to be part of that. So please, with all your support, let's keep the conversation going on the blog, on the WCA site. Don't forget our next webinar on first Tuesday next month, November 5. It's on New China Insights. And please, as this webinar closes, you will be have a survey, exit survey flash up. We want you to take just a couple of minutes. It won't take even that much probably. Please do fill that in and tell us what you thought and what ideas you've got for future webinar topics. We plan to run this well into 2014 and beyond on the first Tuesday of every month. So on behalf of WCA and ASVO, I'd like to thank Sam and Mike very, very much for taking the time to prepare and present for us all today. Well done, team, and well done to everybody who participated in the questions and comments flowing there. They were superb, and that's the beauty of the webinar. No matter where you are in Australia, you can be part of the conversation. So do the exit survey, and thanks again to all of you. Have a great afternoon.